Hey everybody, it's me, Steve Schnee, the CD Junkie. On this episode of CD Junkie, I am going to be talking about BRAM Tchaikovsky. But you can't talk about BRAM Tchaikovsky without talking about the Motors. So I'm going to cover the box sets from the Motors and BRAM Tchaikovsky. So let's start off with the Motors. Now the Motors was formed by Nick Garvey and Annie McMaster, who were in pub rock band Ducks Deluxe. So they put this band together and they brought in guitarist BRAM Tchaikovsky and drummer Ricky Slaughter. Not their real names, but what the heck. And in 1977, they released the debut album Motors, or Motors 1, as that says. I mean, this was almost, I'm going to say, status quo light. You know, it was basically that boogie rock and roll that Status Quo were so famous for at the time. And they were doing a great job at it. Dancing the Night Away, Cold Love, Whiskey and Wine. But basically, it was blues-based. And this is a version in the box set that contains bonus tracks. And initially, this didn't really capture my attention back then because it was just basically just good rock and roll music. But it wasn't until 1978 when they put out the album Approved by the Motors that I really took notice. Holy cow. This was a pop platter, a damn near perfect pop album. Sure, it still had the rock and roll elements of the first album, but they brought in some, a little bit of keyboards and a whole lot of melody. Airport was a hit off of this album. By the way, this is in the box set and contains bonus tracks. But they also had just loads of great songs on this. Breathless, Forget About You, which should have been a U.S. top 10 hit. A song Today, Dreaming Your Life Away. Just an incredibly great pop album. It had elements of pub rock, it had elements of power pop, elements of new wave, elements of rock and roll, and both Andy McMaster and Nick Garvey were great singer-songwriters. Both of them had slightly little gruff voices, but very unique. So when you heard Andy McMaster or Nick Garvey sing, you knew it was the Motors. And really a wonderful album. This album was later reissued with a different album cover when they re-released the single Today, because they were trying to sort of shop it to, a more pop-oriented market. And this looks like a more rock and roll album. Now, sadly, after this album, the band sort of went on a little hiatus, and they let BRAM Tchaikovsky and Ricky Slaughter go. Now, BRAM Tchaikovsky went out and started his own career, and we'll go into that in just a minute. Ricky Slaughter went off and played with other bands, and only Nick Garvey and Andy McMaster remained from the original lineup. And that lineup in 1980 released the album Tenement Steps, which was a completely different album again. So the first album was Status Quo, the second album was this pure pop delight, and the third album was very keyboard dominated. It's not synth pop, but they have a lot of keyboards. It's closer to like maybe, prog rock or like classic rock with a lot of keyboards as opposed to guitars, but there's still plenty of guitars on it. It's a very good album produced by Jimmy Iovine, and it's a very different album though. Love and Loneliness is incredible. Should have been a #1 single all around the world. But there's also, that's what John said, Tenement Steps, Metropolis, and the B-sides. In fact, they had some great B-sides on both Approved by the Motors. There's this great song that's like 3 songs combined into one, Picturama, The Middle Bit, and Soul Surrender from this. And this has some other great singles, Time for Makeup, which is an Andy McMaster song, Crazy Alice, and then it's got Love Around the Corner. These are songs that anybody else would have put on their albums, but they were just B-sides for the Motors. And this was actually it. After this album, the Motors split up and they never returned, but there was a compilation album that came out after they split, humorously titled The Motors' Greatest Hit, because Airport was the only hit they had in the UK. But this box set here, it features a BBC collection that has some live stuff from their early days, from the more rock and roll days. But the Motors were an incredible band that if you haven't listened to them, more than likely you can find these albums on vinyl out in the wild, but I would recommend getting the box set. These 3 albums were available also on CD previously before this box set, I believe with the same bonus tracks. So if this box set is out of print, you can still try to track those albums down. Very much worth your while. But remember I told you about BRAM Tchaikovsky. He, of course, left the band after Approved by the Motors, and he formed his own band featuring Mickey Broadbent on bass and vocals and Keith Boyce on drums, and formed the trio called BRAM Tchaikovsky. Now remember, at this point, BRAM Tchaikovsky, even though that was the name of the guitar player, it was essentially the name of the band, because Mickey Broadbent on bass was just not, a sideman. He was very much one half of the creative part of this band. This is the album with Girl of My Dreams. Came out in 1979. Girl of My Dreams became a power pop classic. BRAM TCHAIKOVSKY is not a power pop band. BRAM TCHAIKOVSKY is a rock and roll band. There's a lot of elements of power pop in it. This is a great album. The only kind of moment for me is their version of the Monkees' I'm a Believer. No, shouldn't have done it. But that's my opinion. But this has, Robber, which is a great song. I'm the One That's Leaving. Strange Man, Change Man, which is the name of the album, if I didn't say that before. And Lonely Dancer, Turn on the Light, Sarah Smiles. And then the bonus tracks on this are amazing because during this period, there were a lot of non-album B-sides, a couple A-sides, and to get them in this box set is truly essentially this box set contains everything that BRAM TCHAIKOVSKY released under the name BRAM TCHAIKOVSKY on Radar Records. But there were a few things like the Lullaby of Broadway single that came out, I think, on Criminal Records, and the Sarah Smile EP that had come out, I think, prior to the album, and all that is included here as well. This is just a great rock and roll record, lots of great hooks. Definitely check it out. It's not all Girl of My Dreams, but it's all great, except for I'm a Believer. But that's just me, So in 1980, out comes the album, The Russians Are Coming. And this is another great rock and roll record. It's odd because the band's two newest members, Keith Line and Dennis Forbes, they are actually the guys featured on the album cover, and they're new members. So to me, it seemed like BRAM TCHAIKOVSKY was really a democracy. Mickey Broadbent actually sang lead on songs on these as well. He was such a great addition to this band. BRAM TCHAIKOVSKY, of course, is the star, the guitar player, the main vocalist. There's great songs in this album like Let's Dance, Letter from the USA. It's funny, this album has a song called Lady from the USA. This album has a song called Letter from the USA. Completely different songs, but both great. It's also got Can't Give You Reasons. It's got Pressure. In fact, this album, when it came out in the U.S., it was retitled Pressure because they thought The Russians Are Coming was a little too sensitive for American public. So they changed the cover to this up here and they called it Pressure. But it's the same album, same order, etc. Now, this CD has bonus tracks and they're all great. Just, Rock and Roll Cabaret. Oh my gosh, it's amazing. There's a Rock and Roll Cabaret from the Lullaby of Broadway EP, and there's a Rock and Roll Cabaret that they re-recorded for the B-side. Incredible, wonderful, wonderful band. But after this, the band split up, and BRAM TCHAIKOVSKY continued under the name BRAM TCHAIKOVSKY, but it was no longer a band. It was just him solo, and put out the album Funland in 1981 on the Arista label. This is a much more pop-oriented album. It's also more eclectic as well. He's got, songs like Shall We Dance, Stand and Deliver, Heart of Stone, Used to Be My Used to Be, Miracle Cure. Here he tries, something, he doesn't go synth pop or anything like that, but, he tries a little bit of rockabilly, and he tries, pop. It's not quite as great as the previous albums, but it's still great. Dennis Forbes, who had joined the band on this album, actually plays on the album. And this is produced by Nick Garvey. Oh my gosh, did I forget to tell you that? Nick Garvey also produced the first BRAM TCHAIKOVSKY album. So Nick Garvey, the leader of the Motors, produced that album, and he produced that album. But after this, that was it. And it's so sad that we haven't been privy to more music by these gentlemen. I know that Andy McMaster has recorded some solo material recently, but I have not heard those. And I do know that Nick Garvey, the other leader of the Motors, he put out an album, I think it was called Blue Skies, in like 81, 82, 83, somewhere around there. And a member of his band was Mickey Broadbent from BRAM TCHAIKOVSKY. So that's it. I've covered BRAM TCHAIKOVSKY and I've covered the Motors. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a medley for you featuring songs from each of the albums I just talked about. Unfortunately, I went a little overboard on the tracks that I put on for Approved by the Motors. I tried to stick with 3 songs from each album, but the little snippets, I didn't think that was enough. So like I said, I put a lot on from Approved by the Motors, but you're going to hear little bits and pieces from each of these albums. This was put out by Cherry Red, and this was put out by Caroline, and you need to add these to your collection. If you love, great bands like, let's say, The Records and Interview and all those wonderful bands from the second British invasion in the late 70s. So sit back, relax, give this a listen, and I will see you on the other side.
like a bird in the wind, like a heavenly dove. Heartache, nothing can keep me from this heartache. I don't mind weeping, it's a heartache. Don't send me away without a heartache. Show me underneath electric lights. Show me dance, be here tonight. Holding on, it feels so right. Standing in you're all you can give, but don't throw the night away. Standing in the silver last dance right when we go, I want to stay. Going out to work, laughing at the jerk that I used to be. I'm living in a world that's completely new to me. But now that I'm in love, it's a realization.
Anyway, that's it. I hope this inspires you to check out both BRAM TCHAIKOVSKY and the Motors. Remember to check out the box sets if you are a CD fan. All these albums are available on vinyl except for the BBC album in the Motors. And I know that these were available on CD separately. And the BRAM TCHAIKOVSKYs, I think, might have been available separately on CD, at least the first two, but they are long out of print. So this is going to be your best bet. I really appreciate you taking the time to watch this video. Remember to like, comment, share, subscribe, to ring that bell for future notifications. And until the next time, remember me, I'm Steve Schnee, the CD Junkie.